By the year 600, the Byzantine Empire was racked with instability. An army they had sent across the Danube to kill the Slavs had mutinied, proclaiming an officer named Phocas as emperor. They succeeded in executing the current emperor, Maurice, but in turn they were executed themselves because they were unable to establish a secure government in Constantinople. The Persians, seeing this weakness, resumed their hostilities with the Byzantines, even threatening Constantinople itself with their army. On the other side of the Bosporus, a Slavic chieftain named Hatsan also saw the weakness in Byzantium, but he moved to Thessaloniki. But the people there by Thessaloniki had already become accustomed to the Slavic presence there after the first siege of Thessaloniki in 586, during the initial Slavic invasion of the Balkans. As you can probably guess by the fact that they're trying again, the first siege didn't go too well. The combined Avar-Slavic army planned for a quick siege, thinking that the recent plague would render the city defenseless. They didn't even establish proper supply lines as not to slow their army down, because they thought that the element of speed would be enough. And it may well have, had they not accidentally laid siege to the fortified sanctuary to Saint Demetrius, the patron saint of Thessaloniki. Once they had realized where the actual city was, the element of surprise was gone, and after 7 days, low organization put an end to the first siege of Thessaloniki. But this time, surely things would be different. This time, they had boats. Hatsan and his coalition of tribes had figured out how to make canoes from hollowing out tree trunks. And with this fleet, they went all across the Aegean, plundering from Achaia to Asia Minor. But this didn't satisfy their desire for plunder. Hatsan couldn't take his eyes off Thessaloniki, a city of immeasurable wealth, but also a fortified one. So the Slavs made camp and began building a grand fleet, one capable of taking such a city. Once again, they planned to do this with the element of surprise by attacking with great speed and great numbers. Unfortunately, once again their surprise was ruined, this time at the hand of a storm, which forced the Slavs to anchor themselves and make camp a few miles outside the city. For 3 days they waited, looking for weak points in the city's defenses, and finally, on the 4th, they launched their attack, from both land and sea. But unfortunately, a lack of organization led to chaos in the army, leading to the eventual failure of the second siege of Thessaloniki. Not willing to give up, the scattered army regrouped and went to the Avar Khagan for help, because, third time's the charm. They brought with them all of the loot and plunder they managed to keep from their previous raids, which they offered to the Khagan in exchange for his assistance. The Khagan, who obliged, gathered an army of Avars and marched on the city after 2 years. He sent ahead of the army a group of scouts, who went in front of the city walls and killed anybody who tried to enter. A few days later, the main army arrived and began setting up siege weapons. This would be the most advanced Slavic siege to this point. The siege seemed like it would be a certain success. The Byzantines were still tied up with the Persians, so couldn't send forces to relieve the city. However, a series of events so unfortunate that the Thessalonians could only attribute it to the miracles of their Saint Demetrius foiled the Slavic attack. First, an Avar siege tower collapsed, killing everyone inside. Then, a gate which the Slavs had set on fire seemed to remain completely untouched. So, after 33 days, the attack was a failure. But the siege wasn't necessarily over. The army still continued to strangle the city of its resources, stopping grain, food, or any sort of water to get into the city. But even this would come to an end when a Byzantine shipment of grain would arrive in the city, helping it survive under these kinds of conditions. So, knowing that they couldn't take the city by force or starve it into submission, they gave up. The Slavs ransomed back the prisoners they had taken during the attack and made peace with the empire. This peace would last for 50 years until, perhaps predictably, in 676, it all came to an end. But to understand why this 50-year peace was broken, we have to go back 2 years to 674, when the prefect of Thessaloniki sent a letter to the emperor accusing the Slavic chieftain Perbundos of the tribe Rinkenoi of planning an attack on the city. The emperor, responding to the letter, captured Perbundos and brought him to Constantinople, where he intended to execute the prisoner. The Slavs pleaded with the emperor, asking him not to kill him and to forgive him of his guilt. The emperor actually obliged, but since he was still tied up in a war with some other tribe, delayed his release until the war was over. An imperial interpreter, who was supposedly controlled by the devil, convinced Perbundos to escape, and gave him his home outside of Constantinople, somewhere in Thrace, as a safe haven. But Bundas obliged, donned Byzantine clothes, and went to that suburban home in Thrace. The imperial army would eventually find him, bring him back to Constantinople, and this time they would keep him there for good, no escaping. At least, according to the Byzantines. But Bundas still thought he had a chance of escape, and so he started planning. This time, before he could even execute his plan, the guards caught wind of it and promptly had him executed. The Slavs, furious at the execution of their chieftain, rose up in rebellion or war. In 676, the Rinconoi, along with a couple other tribes, launched their attack on the city. They started by raiding the suburbs of Thessaloniki, launching 3 or 4 attacks a day. Poor management of the city saw so much hunger and death that many Thessalonians preferred to defect to the Slavic side. It got so bad that the Slavs thought that their ranks would soon become predominantly Greek, so they started selling the defectors to other Slavic tribes as slaves. The Thessalonians needed food fast, so they sent out 10 ships full of able-bodied men to trade with the surrounding tribes who were at peace with the city. The Slavs, sensing their opportunity, enlisted the help of the Drugoviti, a tribe that knew how to build siege engines, and began their assault. While they did make small incursions into the city, their siege engines just weren't effective enough to fully overrun the city's defenses, so they retreated. But once again, they kept up the siege, trying to strangle the city of its resources. This time, they focused on the sea, harassing merchants with the newly built ships that were more advanced than their old canoes and could withstand the full force of the Mediterranean. Unfortunately, both the 10 ships that the Thessalonians had sent out would come back, and an imperial army would arrive, decimating the Slavic force and relieving the city. The Slavs retreated into the hinterland, and this wasn't just a couple men in the army, this was the entire Slavic population around Thessaloniki, packed up their things and left. This would once again create a generational peace between the Slavs and the Byzantines, that is, until a new player enters the game. A player that would threaten to overturn everything in the region, and would even humble the empire themselves. That's next week.